Hi, so this is my sprint video for the last 2 weeks. So since this is my first sprint video, I'll probably go hideously over time. I'm probably gonna upload this anyways. So I guess, so what is my project? My project is Learning Pathways, and so the idea is that when you're learning something new, more likely than not, someone else has already done what it is that you're trying to do. And so I'm trying to find a way to help learners or people who are trying to do something either learn or do that task more quickly using somehow harnessing the uh, expertise of the crowd. And yeah, so the first couple of weeks I did a lot of reading on crowd planning and also intelligent tutoring systems as well as scaffolding. So some of the educational theory. Um, and then so I guess my very first idea was that I wanted somehow for people to get together and to curate links that learners could then use to do a task. And so here was the first thing that I created. It was just a Trello board with all of the links that you could that would help you uh, recreate the Google Keep note-taking app in Angular Meteor. For example, you could filter by different things. So if you were to filter by Meteor Angular setup, then there would be all of these tasks for you to do. And in each of these tasks, there's a link explaining how to do it. And so I decided to go with this because I know that this is how a lot of professional software development groups uh, go, uh, go about planning and implementing a product. So I built this and then I tested it on myself, and I found that even though all the links were there, even for me, uh, the person who wrote this Trello board, it was really hard to structure my steps properly. So even though I wrote this Trello board and I knew what the steps were, it was hard to kind of tick off and do things in a logical order. So I felt that there just wasn't enough structure in the Trello board. I figured that a beginner would have a very hard time putting the steps in order, and so that this probably wasn't the best way to go about scaffolding the learning experience. So I went from there to uh, doing interviews with a lot of learners about how they learned web development, and some of the interesting things I found were that they thought that existing tutorials did not have they were not representative of development in real projects. So one thing was that the folder structure was always very tutorially. So for example, all of the JavaScript might be in a single file, whereas in the real world, in development, a lot of times a lot of the code is modularized. A lot of tutorials do not give motivations for each of the steps that they're doing, and they often just the answer is actually right there. So they'll tell you like, okay, so put this line of code into your JavaScript instead of motivating them to somehow learn how to use the documentation and to find out things on their own. Um, People mention that sometimes it's nice to actually have to figure something out on your own. And then also, uh, tutorials don't always offer a understanding of the higher level architecture and why you're doing something the way you're doing it. So keeping this in mind, I formed a couple of hypotheses about what makes a good tutorial. Um, so, uh, so most importantly, explicitly stating prerequisites helps learners gauge whether or not they're ready or are beyond the tutorial. Explaining motivations helps learners understand how to adapt the action plan if they're trying to do a different task, and then also what to remember, what is most important to remember when looking at a link. Um, Building incrementally helps people learn to build in sprints. It also helps them to frame and give context to each of the steps that they do. Um, Giving a high-level overview of the project helps learners contextualize. Asking learners for self-assessment helps learners think critically about what they learned. So this is, for example, this could be as simple as just using checkboxes and asking people to check off what they have done. Withholding code from learners promotes critical thinking and self-discovery. And then I had a couple more that I guess I haven't really fleshed out yet. So keeping this in mind, I built this action plan, And so, in my mind, the difference between a tutorial, an action plan, and a curriculum is just a bunch of links. That if you read all the links and you understood everything in the links, you could probably build the app you're trying to build. A tutorial gives you step by step every line of code that you should be writing out to build what it is you're trying to build. And then an action plan sort of sits in between, where you're given the plan at a very high level, and then after that, you're just given links and maybe motivations. So this was the action plan I built out for writing a suggestion form. So I begin with a description of what I'm building, and then the high-level plan. So this is essentially what each of the sprints would be. So I would begin by building the static web form, then web form then prints out the contents, then having it send the data to parse, then having form validation. So prerequisites and links to each of the things that you should know. Resources. So this is just all the links inside the rest of the tutorial, the rest of the action plan. And then the action plan, and then within each one, a motivation for why you're doing it, what it is you're doing, and then maybe some tips and some hints and things to keep in mind when you're doing it, and then links that you should probably be looking at. And then a checkbox for each of the things that you need to make sure that you've done. This action plan was built with the hypotheses in mind. And so I will be testing in the next couple of days with different users to see whether or not they can actually learn efficiently with the action plans. So that's the first thing. And then I also want to figure out how I can get a crowd. So either crowdsource or self-source the creation of these action plans.